It's always nice to be on right after lunch. Everybody is rested and sharp. Well, I'm going to talk primarily about just a couple of rehabilitation projects on Lake Michigan. Do a little overview on the status, although I'll get back into some of the status a little later on. But I primarily want to say that I'm really just the voice piece up here. There's a whole cast of characters that are contributors to the wealth of sturgeon knowledge that's being amassed across the basin from a whole number of different projects. I've had a very little role in a lot of these, and so I need to acknowledge all of these folks in various forms and for the data that they've provided that I'll do my best to try to present today. I think I'll also, in the interest of time, forego the courtesy of an outline slide. You guys are a pretty sharp crowd. I'm sure you'll be able to keep up. It's a short talk. And you'll be surprised about what I talk about instead of telling you ahead of time. 5 years ago and 10 years ago, when we were doing this Lake Michigan session, I spoke about the status of primarily the remnant or existing remaining wild populations of sturgeon across the basin. I'm not going to spend much time talking about those today. Fortunately, sturgeon are a long-lived, slow-growing species, and things change slowly. So I'll be focusing more on some of the recruitment stuff and some of the new restoration efforts. But to suffice to say, things are pretty much as they were for these wild remnant populations, at least for the adult stocks. So the white numbers here represent an approximation of the number of adult fish in these populations. They're still very, very small in terms of historic abundance. The highlights are up in the Menominee River and the Peshtigo River in Green Bay, where the abundance of adult fish in those populations is in some cases an order of magnitude higher than elsewhere around the basin. But in I think only in the St. Joe and the Manistee are there concerns that those populations may fade away in the future without significant effort, and it's difficult to know exactly what that effort might be. But everybody else, all the other populations appear to be holding their own or improving, as I'll talk about in a bit. What I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on are the last decade's worth of work in streamside rearing. This is a multi-agency, six-river coordinated partnership involving participants from across the basin. And there's 6 facilities on Lake Michigan. They can be broken down into 2 different groups. The ones shown here in the red stars are what we call reintroduction sites. And so these are rivers that were not known to have sturgeon previously, so the populations that might have occurred historically have been extirpated, so it was a good place to do a reintroduction effort. And so those are the 4 on the western shore, 2 in Green Bay and 2 on the western shore of Wisconsin. And then the 2 green stars represent what I call supplementation sites. So these are remnant populations that are needing assistance. So trying to increase the rate of recovery or the recruitment in those populations. Streamside rearing is also used in those situations. One of the prerequisites is having donor populations that you can draw upon to get eggs, gametes from. And in these cases, for the cedar and whitefish facility, the donor population is the Menominee, and if not the Menominee, the Peshtigo. So 2 close-by populations, fairly genetically similar and appropriate sources for reintroductions into those 2 sites. For the Kewaunee and Milwaukee facility, the 2 that Wisconsin DNR operates, they have it good. They've got the Wolf River to go to, a large population. You can just walk up on the sides of the river and scoop the fish out. So access to gametes is pretty simple in that case. As I mentioned, this is a large partnership involving a number of organizations. Michigan DNR operates the cedar and whitefish facility in northern Green Bay. Wisconsin DNR is the primary lead for the facilities in the Kewaunee and the Milwaukee. But in the Milwaukee River, it's also partnered with River Edge Nature Center, which provides a large wealth of volunteers who actually do most of the day-to-day operation of that facility, a significant advantage. The Little River Band of Ottawa Indians runs the Manistee River facility. That one's been in operation the longest, for over 10 years. And then there's a group of us, Fish and Wildlife Service, Michigan DNR, Gun Lake Tribe, and Sturgeon for Tomorrow, that join forces to work on the Kalamazoo River. And I should mention Michigan State University up on the Black River is a nice research facility that has helped provide a lot of information to make these facilities more successful, particularly in the later years, through findings of research that they have done in partnership with all of the rest of us. For those that don't know, streamside rearing takes advantage of pumping water out of the river into the small trailer-based hatcheries that are sited along the rivers where the fish are intended to be introduced into. The reason is it simply increases the likelihood of imprinting and fidelity for these fish to the target rivers. That's the intent and that's the hope. It'll be a long-term evaluation to find out how effective that truly is. The other expectation that with increased fidelity brings a minimized risk, genetic risk to the remnant populations, in which a large number of stocked fish that exceeds the number of wild fish being produced each year, there's always concern of straying into those populations and loss of some of the genetic integrity of those wild stocks. And then, as I mentioned, it's suitable for both supplementation and reintroduction efforts. Back when we were getting started with streamside rearing, most of us that were involved, all of us that were involved in these streamside rearing facilities on Lake Michigan, worked with a number of, so that would be Ed Baker, Brad Eggold, Marty Holtgren, myself, worked with a number of geneticists to come up with these genetic stocking guidelines, which have provided a number of criteria, guidelines that work as nice benchmarks for us to measure our success as this program continues. And so I'll go into a couple of these as we look at how this project has progressed in the last 10 years. One of those things is, how are we doing with bringing in the genetic diversity to begin with from the donors? And so this was an objective to make sure that there's enough genetic diversity, enough parents contributing gametes to the fish that you're stocking. And so the criteria initially has been, as a minimum, at least effective population size of 8, which basically you get by taking 4 females per year, different females throughout the duration of the study, 4 different females per year mated with at least 2 males per female will get you that minimum criteria of 8. And that's what the projects were fairly successful in meeting for the first 4 or 5 years. And then through some increased capabilities in the trailers, we were able to split up the tanks, the rearing tanks inside, to allow for separate rearing of more female families. And so one of the other criteria is that you stock equal numbers, or you attempt to stock as equal numbers as possible from each of the female families that you're rearing in the facilities. And so by increasing the capability, the capacity in the trailer, those facilities that were drawing from the Wolf River, where it's easy to get females, were able to increase their number of females to 8 females, and then usually mated with 4 males per female in equal egg batches for those years. So you can see the criteria has been in large part met over most of the years. Minimum target of an effective population size annually of 8, with a recommended target when you've got a large donor population of 20. And so the Kewaunee and Milwaukee rivers have been able to take advantage of that fairly available donor population in the Wolf River. And we want to look at numbers stocked. So the supplementation sites are a little bit different. There, you're not using a donor population from some other river. You're using the river in which you're working in as the donor population. And because the populations are small and thus needing rehabilitation assistance, females are not readily available. So the typical gamete collection technique is wild fertilized eggs collected directly from the river, or drifting larvae after those wild eggs hatch. So this is fairly labor intensive, and it means you're dealing with a lower numbers game. You're not able to go out and collect thousands and thousands of eggs on a typical year. So the expectations for these facilities is really just to catch a large enough proportion of the eggs and larvae that you can afford them enhanced survival during the rearing season, so that when you stock them back out, you might be able to increase the recruitment in that system, maybe as much as doubling the recruitment. And so that's been the target here. As a result, the stock numbers are fairly low over time. Part of that is just learning the tricks of the trade in order to maximize survival. And in the last few years, particularly in the Manistee facility, you'll see their stocking numbers increasing pretty significantly, so they're up in the several hundred category. And actually in 2014, their number would have been twice as much as well had they not had a system failure in their rearing facility, which cut their numbers in half partway through the rearing season. So for the last 3 years, at least on the Manistee system, they've been fairly successful, I think, meeting their objectives that they had when they went into that program. The Kalamazoo is still just a tough nut to crack. It's a very small population, and getting your hands on eggs and larvae is a difficult task there. So we're still evaluating the long-term likelihood that that project will be successful. We're still keeping our fingers crossed. To rescale this figure now to compare the stocking numbers for the other introduction facilities. First of all, in northern Green Bay, and I should mention most of these figures I've attempted to keep the color coding similar, so the green bars are for northern Green Bay. Blue bars will be for the blue waters of Lake Michigan off the shore here in Milwaukee, and the red bars are for the supplementation sites over on the Michigan shore. Again, stocking numbers were variable in the early years, working out some of the bugs in the system. There were some early successes in the cedar and the whitefish in 2010. All of a sudden, survival worked really well, and they ended up with a lot more fish than they really wanted. So we learned some lessons through that process, and then kind of recalibrate things. And Ed Baker's been doing a good job in the last 4 or 5 years in keeping those numbers consistent. And in fact, in 2015, up to over 1,000 fish stocked out of those 2 facilities this last year, with expectations of those same numbers in future years, right, Ed? Yep. And then for the 2 Wisconsin facilities, the Kewaunee and the Milwaukee, again, they've got the luxury of having an abundance of eggs every year at the start, and have therefore been able to maintain pretty good numbers all the way through. Survival's less of an issue because they can collect excess eggs and make sure they've got enough fish. In 2009, a little bit better survival than anticipated, and the growing pains of figuring out what to do with a whole bunch of extra larvae that a bunch of volunteers have become very attached to. And do you dump them on the ground, or do you release them into the river? And they had, I think, did a good job of educating the public that was involved in the facility as to the importance of not stocking too many fish from these facilities and keeping the numbers constant, which they've been very successful at. In meeting the goals. So the targets in the Genetic Conservation Guide was to stock, and that this group determined was to target 1,250 fish per facility per year. Some of them are stocked out a little smaller, so you expect a little bit lower survival. So actually, when you combine the smaller ones and the larger ones, they're actually stocking about 1,500 per year, which is a reasonable target for these facilities. So that's been going pretty well. Overall, the years in the last 5 or 6 years, been stocking close to 4,000 to 5,000 fish annually from all of these facilities combined, and the total number is now up over 31,000 sturgeon stocked into Lake Michigan from the Streamside rearing facilities over the last 10 years. That's a significantly greater number than is likely occurring from wild recruitment. So you would expect this to have a significant effect in the long term. The project is only about 1/3 of the way through its intended 25-year span in order to develop founding populations of in the neighborhood of 750 mature spawning adults per river. So that's the intended target long term. I'm going to just snap through some pictures that I think are illustrative of the fact that sturgeon are different than all other fish. And these are just some shots from some of the various release events that happen every year at these facilities. So this was last year here on the shores of the Milwaukee. There's Brad out on the dock hyping up the crowd with the mic. He actually got into it and cheering and clapping and the whole bit. It's an interesting process to watch. Thousands of people turn out, and generally the fish get stocked one by people carrying them down to the water and releasing them out of a bucket or by hand. So it's an interesting experience to watch. It's just not the Milwaukee. The Little Manistee facility, the Little River Band, has done a great job over the years of bringing the community out every year. Hundreds of people show up, even in years when there's fairly few numbers being stocked. They'll line up for the chance to escort a fish down to the water and release it by hand into the river. And even on the Kalamazoo, where our numbers stocked have been fairly low, people turn out in the hundreds to take part in these types of adventures. I think it's just an illustration that, as I said, sturgeon are different, and in a way, this is bringing an important dimension that we don't often see in fisheries management. The involvement of public interest groups and support, often from a constituent group that we've not often worked with as much in the past. This has been an important aspect of these sturgeon stocking projects, completely separate from the success based on numbers and future biological effect in the population. It's making a difference to the public, and it's something that's important to remember. This is what we're, as biologists, more, I think, interested in or expecting, the occurrence of these fish out in the lake in various assessment gears. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. First of all, the movement of the streamside reared fish. Ed Baker's been good at keeping up a figure just showing some of the long distance movements. These are not the typical movements. You still catch the largest number of fish from the streamside rearing facilities in the waters in close proximity to where they're released, and that is likely to continue to be the case. But these fish will wander around, and so all of the facilities, the Milwaukee's, at least here, appears to have fish that have wandered the furthest distance, but remember they're also the facility that's released the most fish over the years. One can speculate as to the effect of colder shore waters on Wisconsin as opposed to the warmer waters on the Michigan shoreline, and whether that has any long-term lasting hold on where fish end up, and similarly the warm waters of Green Bay. But all of the facilities have shown fish moving a fair distance in a fairly short period of time. So these are just 1 or 2 year old, 3 year old fish finding their way to long distance sections of the lake. The cedar and whitefish facilities have had fish disperse. Maybe it's because of Green Bay that we haven't seen them dispersing outside of Green Bay. It's a nice ideal habitat for sturgeon. If we look at the sizes that these fish have grown to within waters that are fairly different across the basin, so for the manistee fish recaptured along the Michigan shoreline, those shown in red, it looks like size at age. Age here represented in days, and the groups of days at the bottom are also years, so just years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. There doesn't seem to be any difference in growth between fish that are spending their life in the nearshore waters on the Michigan side of the lake as opposed to the Wisconsin side of the lake in the Milwaukee Harbor versus those that are stocked into the facilities in northern Green Bay and spend their time and are recaptured up in northern Green Bay waters. To me, this means all of them are finding adequate food. Their growth rates seem to be good and comparable. We're not seeing significant differences across the populations. And in fact, it looks like it's right on track with what we see for wild fish of these ages up in Green Bay from work done a number of years ago. So I think this is a good sign. They're finding plenty to meet their needs in life and are probably surviving well. Of real interest is the occurrence of these, not these fish, but juvenile sturgeon in index assessment nets fish throughout the lake. And in this case, we're making use of people in this room, a lot of you will be familiar with the Lake-Wide Assessment Plan, or LWAP surveys. These are conducted by Michigan DNR on the Michigan shoreline using graded mesh, 1.5 to 6 inch mesh nylon throughout the time series that I queried out of the database here. In recent years, they've added mono to that, and it looks like the catch rates in the monofilament nets are slightly higher, thus the dashed line at the end of this time series. But I think this is a fairly significant trend. Sample sizes are low, but it seems to be a steady increase in abundance of these fish showing up in these assessment nets. These are primarily wild fish showing up in this survey. There's only a few of these that came from the streamside rearing facilities. Remember, this is on the Michigan shoreline where most of the fish are coming from those remnant populations, like the Muskegon, the Grand, the Manistee, and the Kalamazoo. I think this is a good story to see, and it's nice to see the survey nets showing the trend. If you look at the sizes of the fish that are captured, it looks like a fairly consistent size fish that are recruiting to this gear over time. So this isn't necessarily one cohort being tracked through time. This looks like it's a continual input of what we would call subadult fish less than 1,000 millimeters. The adults are either not in these waters. Likely the survey is done in the spring when you'd expect the adults to be more associated with the river mouths and the rivers if they're returning to spawn. The meshes are also not large enough to really select for large adults. So this is what we call a subadult or juvenile appropriate gear. And again, I think this is indicative of regular recruitment coming from these sources. If we rescale this and look at a couple other locations in the lake, the green dotted line here comes from northern Green Bay in the Bay de Nox area and Cedar River area. Troy Zorn has been doing a fish community assessment up there again over a nice long time series and has encountered enough fish that we can make some comparisons in catch rates. So these are waters that are in close proximity to some of those streamside rearing facilities, the whitefish and the cedar. which I think explains the higher catch rates. A large number of these fish are presumably from that streamside rearing stocking efforts. And so you see higher catch rates in those waters, ideal sturgeon waters, than what you see on the open waters on the Michigan side. And then I've been working with a commercial fisherman down in far southern Green Bay, so more than 100 miles away from any of the nearby stocking locations. So, but again, fish likely coming from the wild populations, the Peshtigo, the Ocano, the Menominee. Only one of his fish were recaptures of streamside facilities. The rest were wild. This trend doesn't look like it's necessarily upward. The blue squares look like it's been a fairly consistent catch rate over time. And again, another good indication. So just final two things to mention, different topics, but just wanted to report that people are aware that there continues to be a real challenge for the sea lamprey control program to implement treatment for lampreys without having some non-target effects on lake sturgeon. I applaud the sea lamprey control program and the work that they have done to try to deal with this issue. It's been recognized for a while, but it's just a tough nut to crack, and sturgeon are susceptible, and if you're going to be effective in killing lamprey, there's going to be some non-target effects on sturgeon. And this was made fairly evident in assessments done on the Muskegon River in 2014, where Michigan, Little River Band, and Fish and Wildlife Service gathered together to do both pre and post assessments, and were able to show a drop in catch rates of sturgeon post-treatment versus pre-treatment, but more significantly, we collected 31 dead young of the year sturgeon in that system. Again, it's not a large number, but when you're doing streamside rearing, and in some cases spending a whole year trying to stock out fish that are around or in the hundreds, and you lose 30 fish from a year class, there's interest in doing what can be done. And Little River Band has, I was going to mention, these are just a couple of rivers that this is likely to be a problem. Jeff Slade put together a nice graph a number of years ago talking about alkalinity, and the Manistee and the Muskegon have the highest alkalinity issues in the basin. So these are likely the two rivers that you'll see this problem the most. Little River Band has decided to be proactive and offer up their streamside rearing facility as sort of a temporary holding site so that fish can be collected out of the river pre-treatment this year, brought in, and then released back into the river after the TFM treatment as a means of being proactive. So with that, I'd like to close by just saying there are some other significant efforts in the basin, one being fish passage on the Menominee River. I'm not going to talk about it here other than to say 2 of 3 phases were constructed last year. The third phase will be constructed this year. Sturgeon are being passed upriver, and we're starting a period of evaluation over the next probably half dozen years or longer. There will be some interesting findings that should have implications for future fish passage for sturgeon. This is not a well-found science at all. So we look for some interesting things in the years to come. With that, thank you, and I'm sure I'm out of time.